Dr. Christopher Seimer received his PhD from the University of Minnesota and is now a lecturer at the University of Wisconsin, River Falls. This fall, he received River Falls' Excellence in Teaching Award. Much like Harold Deutsch, Dr. Seimer is a master teacher, and many of his students often, when Dr. Seimer speaks, many of his students often come here also. As for the rest, I will read to you what Harold Deutsch said of Dr. Seimer in 1992. I consider him to be among the most promising graduate students it has been my privilege to encounter in 45 years of teaching at Minnesota. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Christopher Seimer.
As a student of this period for most of my life, really, one of the things that I think is very difficult for modern audiences to appreciate about the remarkable story of the Nazis and this entire period of the Weimar Republic in Germany is what one of my professors in Austria described as one needs a Vergangenheitsgefühl, or a feeling for the past. And as I was thinking about what to say today, I want to take us back to the year of 1918 and the incredible changes that are going to occur in such rapid succession, not just in Germany, but throughout Europe generally, but Germany in particular. And so in the last months of the war, which the World War I, through the summer, the German armies had been advancing into France faster than they had done since the beginning of World War I. The Germans felt that they were on the verge of victory, but then the Americans show up and wreck it all. And then in their withdrawal, the war effort is over, and the German military realized this. But then what's going to happen very quickly, the government begins to collapse, and by October of 1918, Wilson has made his 14 points proposal, and Germany's been willing to accept it. And the beginning of the crack up of the German state begins. And so in October, towards the end of October, the Imperial German fleet was ordered to do a suicide run against the British, when the war was clearly over, and the soldiers will mutiny. And so that the sailors, will mutiny in Wilhelmshaven and a mutiny in Kiel in November. And so they're going to, this is considered the beginning of a German revolution, where the troops are actually taking possession and driving the old regime out. Wilson will also then, in October, insist on signing a peace treaty with a democratic Germany rather than the Germany under the rule of the Kaiser. And so in incredible succession in 1918, in November, 9th of November, the Philipp Scheidemann of the Social Democratische Partei Deutschland, the SPD, will proclaim a new German republic, simply proclaiming it as the Kaiser's government literally blows town. A few hours later, however, Karl Liebknecht of the Marxist Spartacus League is going to declare a free socialist republic of Germany. And so this is all before the armistice has happened. Germany is falling apart internally. And in the broader context, we have the communist revolution in Russia in 1917, and it's progressing into the violent Russian Civil War. So with the Kaiser's abdication, numerous dynasties that had been in power for centuries are gone in a matter of months from the end of World War I. The Hohenzollern dynasty disappears. The Kaiser scoots off to Holland and goes into retirement. And so suddenly Germany is forced to create a new government at the same time that the trauma of World War I is just coming to an end. And in this environment then, the Social Democratic Party of Germany has to assemble a republic literally out of nothing. And at the end of 1918, December 31st, the Communist Party of Germany is founded. 5 days later, the precursor of the Nazi Party is founded. And so as we get into the 1920s, the fabric of German society is literally being torn apart. The aristocracy, the Kaiserreich, is over, and now there's communist-inspired or revolutions appearing in towns and cities across Germany, which the fledgling government under the Social Democrats are forced to put down, because these revolts are very explicitly advocating a system like is being built in Russia. So for example, in 1919, the Communist Party will have a huge march in Berlin in March. In April of 1919, a Bavarian Soviet Republic will be proclaimed. And in this chaos then, the Social Democrats, who would be considered the liberals of German politics, because of the strictures of the war, they have no armed forces except demobilizing veterans coming directly from the front to deal with all of these revolts that are breaking out. This will be, we start seeing the emergence of the Freikorps, which are essentially independent paramilitary units made up of essentially hardcore right-wingers whose approach to politics was founded on the Western Front. As one of them said, we didn't know what we wanted, but we knew how to get it. And the future will be hammered out on an anvil of blood. With niceties like this animating the spirit of the Freikorps, the Social Democrats then, to put down communist revolts, start expanding this extra legal role of radical right-wing groups. And this is all happening in the space of months after the armistice happened. So the Soviet Republic will ultimately be put down. And while this is all going on, the Allies will only lift their blockade of food to Germany in July of 1919. So economic conditions are that the German caloric intake was actually at almost starvation levels in 1919, and chaos rapidly ensues. So it's in this context of the Weimar Republic never had a chance to right itself. And what we will start to see, there will be various putsches and revolts. There will be a right-wing putsch in Berlin in 1920. And they're at the same time, they're trying to organize parties for the Reichstag. And no party gets anything near a majority, so they're forced into rather clumsy coalitions. But by the time we get through the 1920s and into 1921, this is all happening so quickly, now the Paris Peace Conference is beginning to impose ruinous penalties against this new republic, against a social democrat government that didn't start World War I, but is now being held responsible for the costs and the guilt of World War I, as you're familiar with. So we have armed paramilitary groups as the appendage of the government. We've got explicitly communist and Soviet-inspired revolutionaries popping up left and right. And we're trying to create a working constitution with political parties when the previous political system has simply evaporated. And the Allies are imposing massive economic burdens on you. And so you can see that the situation in the 1920s was truly chaotic. Now, one indicator of just how bad things are going to get in the 1920s in Germany. In 1914, $1 US bought you 4 Reichsmarks. As we get to 1922, in August, it was 2,000 Reichsmarks to $1. In October, it was 4,500 Reichsmarks to the dollar. In November of 1922, it was 10,000 Reichsmarks to the dollar. But that is that's nothing compared to 1923, when we enter the truly hyperinflation phase. In June, 70,000 Reichsmarks. At the end of June, 150,000 Reichsmarks. And by September, 10 million Reichsmarks to the dollar. So what this effectively does is completely eviscerates all the savings and all of the economic foundation of the German middle class and everyone else. And I'm trying to, and again, so what's happening? Well, this inflation rate completely spirals out. And as my colleagues were saying in their nice discussion on the history of this, people are literally, they're stealing baskets of money and dumping out the money to keep the basket because it's worth more. Now, in this environment of 1920, and as I say, putting ourselves back in this time period, the post-war repercussions, we've got a civil war raging in Russia. In 1922, Benito Mussolini with the Puliti Neri, the black shirts, will march on Rome, and suddenly a fascist dictatorship is established in Italy, and Italy was on the winning side of World War I. And so the rise of radical alternatives to pre-existing systems is already in place in the 1920s, as we'll see. Now, there's going to be and the fledgling Nazi Party will throw its putsch in 1923 in Munich. Very abortive, but in the context of Weimar politics, this was just one takeover of a town among hundreds that had been breaking out since 1919. And so there will be a period of stability that comes in. The American financial help, which the Dawes plan, cools down the inflation. And so if there's a brief period of time in the late 1920s, the Nazi Party gets 2.8% of the vote in the Reichstag elections in 1928. Wow. And so it is the smallest party in the Reichstag in 1928. But then, again, through historical circumstance and unbelievable bad luck, just when it looked like the Weimar was beginning to stabilize in the late 20s, 1929, the stock market crash and the world Great Depression hits. The impact of this, in 1930, the Nazi Party will go from being the 9th party in the Reichstag to the 2nd largest party in the Reichstag. And what you'll start to see in the early 1930s, the Communist Party and the Nazi Party, by the 1932 elections, if you put the communists and the Nazis together, they would have a majority in the Reichstag, meaning more than 50% of the seats in the legislature were held by political parties intending to overthrow the government. That's how radical the situation was getting. And so, if you want to look at Weimar culture, it clearly reflects the almost psychotic breakdown of the society. We'll see German expressionistic films like Das Kabinett des Dr. Caligari's, Metropolis, with these wild sets. If you ever see the motion picture Die Blaue Engel, or The Blue Angel, with Marlene Dietrich as a nightclub singer who leads a bourgeois professor to his doom by falling into the den of sin that was Weimar Germany. In Germany, it suddenly becomes a place of unbelievable cultural excess. So pornography, the use of cocaine, very open homosexual bars and nudity. Berlin becomes the sex center of the world in the late 1920s, while the 20s were roaring, because so many layers of social breakdown had occurred. So it's in this context, then, that the Nazis are going to represent a definite anti-communist force, but also if you look at the political campaigns of Hitler, he's wearing a suit and tie. He's not wearing a uniform. He presents himself as the savior of German traditionalism, and in the crisis set up by more political machinations, he's brought in to the government as chancellor in 1933 after a series of temporary chancellors that had been appointed by the president because the political parties in the Reichstag were at each other's throats and no one could ever get a majority or even form a coalition. So the president, Hindenburg, would appoint the chancellor to rule for a while. And Hitler's brought in as chancellor in a temporary coalition, which was meant to stop gains by the communists. And then again, things happened so quickly that the Germans really didn't know what they were seeing. So he becomes chancellor in 1934, and then we have the Reichstag fire, which will then precipitate the decree from the president temporarily suspending the civil rights of the Germans because of communist attack, the prospect of a terrorist attack leading to civil rights abuses is one you may be familiar with. In any event, then there's going to be the Enabling Act. Then Hitler is going to begin to arrest his political opponents. He'll still have an election, and once again, barely squeaks by. With the death of Hindenburg, however, he will appoint himself Fuhrer, and by the time we get into 1934, the Nazis have a stranglehold on the state. So when we think about the Nazi rise to power, there was nothing about it that was inevitable, in my opinion. And we also have to place it in the context of the multiplicity of explosions happening across Europe, the rise of fascism in Italy, the communist civil war in Russia, the complete collapse of Austria-Hungary. When the Ottoman Empire bellied up in 1919, that left the Middle East in the shape it's in today. And so my argument would be that the background of all of this, if you look at the chaos that ensued as early as 1919, 1920, that will be one key to unlock our understanding of the rise of Hitler. That being said, it is my honor and privilege to introduce a very distinguished speaker tonight, David McKEAN, a former ambassador to Luxembourg, a graduate of Harvard University, the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, and Duke University Law School. He is a former director of policy planning for the State Department and spent many years as working very closely as chief of staff to Senator John Kerry in Washington, D.C. He's written numerous books and many articles, and we are indeed lucky to have him here today. So I will introduce David.
I want to thank all of you for being here tonight. I want to especially thank Colonel Don Patton and the staff and volunteers of the Roundtable for their hospitality. My wife Kathleen is here, and they've just been so generous with their time, taking us around Minneapolis and St. Paul, and we really enjoyed ourselves. This is actually my first trip to Minnesota. Kathleen's been here before because her mom and dad were born in St. Paul. So over the years, I've heard a lot about Minnesota. But I really am honored to be here, delighted to be with you on this special day on Veterans Day. So we're going to show photos from the book. It's not going to necessarily synchronize with what I'm talking about. So if you don't like what I'm talking about, you can just watch the screen. And if you don't have a book, you'll actually get a chance to see everything that is in it. As Colonel Patton mentioned, I'm a former ambassador to the Grand Duchy of Luxembourg. And some of you may have only a vague idea where Luxembourg is located. And I confess you may need a very large map to find such a very small country. But Luxembourg played an important role in World War II. It was overrun by the Nazis in 1940, and then liberated by the Allies in 1944, only to be overrun once again during the Battle of the Bulge. And actually the residence for the ambassador was occupied by Nazi officers. It's also home to the second largest U.S. military cemetery in Europe. There are over 4,000 American soldiers buried at Ham Cemetery. It also happens to be where General George Patton is buried. And when I was ambassador, I participated in many events and services at Ham, including on Veterans Day. And I had the privilege of meeting several sons and daughters and grandchildren of fallen heroes. So I was inspired by my time in Luxembourg to write a book, not necessarily about World War II, but about the events leading up to World War II. And I had another inspiration as well. In 2004, I wrote a book about a fellow named Tommy Corcoran, who some of you may have heard of, but probably not. He was a very, very colorful political operative from Providence, Rhode Island. But he was arguably, at a time, and during a period, Roosevelt's most important domestic policy advisor. Certainly one of his principal political advisors. And Franklin Roosevelt never cared much for professional titles. So I wondered, well, who was his most important foreign policy advisor? Particularly during the 1930s. Who was Roosevelt's Tommy Corcoran in the events leading up to World War II? And as you can tell from the subtitle of Watching Darkness Fall, this is a group biography. It's primarily the story of four ambassadors: William Dodd, the U.S. ambassador to Germany; Breckinridge Long, the ambassador to Italy; William Bullitt, our nation's first ambassador to the Soviet Union, and then later ambassador to France; and then a name who many of you may be familiar with, Joseph P. Kennedy, the U.S. ambassador to the Court of St. James. And the book also includes a supporting cast: the president's wife, Eleanor Roosevelt; the Secretary of State, Cordell Hull; the Undersecretary, Sumner Welles; and Presidential Advisor, Harry Hopkins. So one person who read this book has called it a diplomatic team of rivals. And another has referred to it as the fog of peace. And yet a third friend said it is the diplomatic story of the sometimes and somewhat wise men. And all, I suppose, are somewhat true. So as Germany devolved under Hitler into a brutal and murderous dictatorship that ultimately threatened all of Europe, I tried to write a book about Roosevelt's ambassadors, who clearly were a problematic team of men who had little in common except that they really witnessed and interpreted for their boss, for the president, the most tumultuous events leading up to World War II. So it's very much the story of President Roosevelt's fateful decision to ultimately take the country to war. And finally, I think the book tells, to some extent, the story of how America defined itself and it defined its role in the world. So let me take you back briefly to the campaign of the 1932 election, which pitted New York Governor Franklin Roosevelt against the incumbent President Herbert Hoover. Foreign policy was not an issue at the time. In fact, Roosevelt never mentioned it. The campaign took place during the height of the Great Depression. There was 25% unemployment. The GDP had fallen to a level not seen since the turn of the century. Families were being displaced. There was poverty, hunger, misery. And the advice from Roosevelt's campaign was, don't make any gaffes, and please don't talk about foreign policy. And as everybody knows, Roosevelt won easily. Hoover never had a chance. Now, during the 1930s, Roosevelt was consumed by the challenges of the Great Depression, but he was also very much his own Secretary of State. And he relied on his ambassadors to be his eyes and his ears on the ground. He deeply valued their insights and their reporting. And as you know, the president was confined to a wheelchair. He did not travel abroad during the 1930s. Yet what I found so interesting is that before television, before the internet, before social media, Roosevelt was actually very well informed about international affairs. And he gathered information from a variety of sources. In assessing the state of affairs in Europe, he considered his ambassadors in Berlin, in Rome, in Paris, and London to be of paramount importance. So he kept very much in close contact with them. He wrote them letters, he read their memos, and not many presidents in the 20th century read their ambassadors' memos. And whenever they're in Washington, he'd like to meet with them personally. So I'll return to Roosevelt in a few minutes, but first I want to give you just a thumbnail sketch of each of the ambassadors that I discuss in Watching Darkness Fall. And because I relied heavily on the correspondence between these men and the president, I'll be reading excerpts from their letters, from their diplomatic cables, and from their diaries. It's their voices that really matter. So in 1933, only months after Roosevelt had been sworn in as president, he began searching for someone to fill the important post of ambassador to Germany, and he wanted someone of stature to fill that position. He recognized that Germany was in deep trouble. The president actually had a very difficult time filling the position. A number of prominent men turned him down. You may remember that Roosevelt had run for national office before. In 1920, he was on the national ticket with Governor James Cox of Ohio. He asked Cox in 1933 if he would be our representative in Berlin. Cox said, no way. He flatly turned him down. So did others. Roosevelt eventually settled on a little-known academic named William Dodd, who was the chair of the history department at the University of Chicago. And William Dodd had been raised in Clayton, North Carolina. Now, I spent a lot of my youth and childhood in North Carolina, and I can tell you Clayton is a very, very small town. Dodd graduated from Virginia Tech, and during his college years, he spent a year studying in Germany, and later, during his time at the University of Chicago, he wrote a very complimentary book on fellow Southerner Woodrow Wilson. And when Roosevelt selected him, Dodd was working on a multi-volume history of the South. I think it's fair to say that Dodd had absolutely no idea what he was getting into. He didn't really know anything about American politics. He didn't really know anything about German politics. He had no diplomatic training. He'd never had a job outside of academia, and in stark contrast to most of the Ivy League educated diplomats serving in Europe at the time, he was not a wealthy man. But he did speak adequate German. And how Roosevelt hired Dodd in the summer of 1933 is actually it's a good story. I mean, Roosevelt literally called him on the phone to offer him the job. He'd only met Dodd once before. So Professor Dodd answers the phone in his office, and on the other end of the line, this voice comes on and says, "Hello, Professor, this is Franklin Roosevelt. I have a great favor to ask of you. I need you to serve our country." Now, Dodd couldn't decide if someone was actually playing a joke on him or not. He was literally speechless. The president continued to talk, and he said, he assured him he really was President Roosevelt, and if possible, he wanted to see him in the White House, that week. And so Dodd dutifully went down to Washington to meet with the president. He entered the Oval Office, and he was sitting across from Roosevelt, who once again asked him to serve as ambassador to Germany. Dodd was, I think, now understood that this was not a joke, and he accepted on the spot. He was also confirmed by the Senate on a voice vote a few weeks later. He never had a hearing before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. I was a staff director of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. We confirmed a number of ambassadors. Every single one of them got a hearing. Ambassadors always have to have a hearing. Let's just say the vetting was a little light. Dodd moved his family, his wife, his son, and his daughter to Berlin. And after only a few months, he had a taste of what life would be like in Nazi Germany. As Hitler gained increasing power within the German government, Nazi thugs roamed the streets, locking up political opponents. Yet in his first letter to Roosevelt, Dodd equivocated. And this is what he wrote to the president. It is impossible as yet to say whether the new regime here is going to take a more liberal or a more ruthless direction. One must remember that German statesmen are quite adolescent in their analysis of international problems, that people have never learned the give and take group compromises which English and Americans always apply. I love that phrase, give and take group compromises, and how Dodd felt it characterized American politics. I'm not sure that people would characterize it that way today. Returning to the letter, Dodd wrote the president, "The Germans are much concerned about United States attitudes, but hardly know how to ease off their dangerous position. This especially applies to the Jewish persecutions." So this is 1933, and on the issue of Hitler's treatment of Jews, Dodd is way ahead of the American people. He's also, frankly, way ahead of Roosevelt, whose main objective for his ambassador in Germany, and this was alluded to earlier, was really increased bilateral trade and restitution or reparations from World War I. So Roosevelt never became especially close to Dodd on a personal level, but he began to pay close attention to the ambassador's letters and cables because he sensed that Dodd did give him the unvarnished truth about what was actually happening in Germany under Hitler. And in the fall of 1935, after becoming aware of the extent of Germany's remilitarization, Dodd wrote to Roosevelt warning, and this is a direct quote, "If Italy, Germany, and Japan at some critical moment move at the same time in their spheres, I cannot see any way to stop dictatorships." So this is in 1935. William Dodd, a small-town academic, is far more prescient than any of his colleagues in the State Department. But Dodd's also extremely unhappy in his position. He's unhappy because he feels powerless to in any way influence the Nazi regime, and he feels totally unsupported in Washington, D.C. at the State Department. He leaves his post at the beginning of 1937, but he continued to speak out widely about the dangers that Hitler posed to Europe and to the United States. In a speech at the Harvard Club in Boston in 1938, Dodd warned his audience that Hitler was a megalomaniac who would plunge Europe into war. He emphasized Hitler's hatred of Jews, and he declared, "Hitler intends to kill them all." Again, Dodd was very prescient as to Hitler's intentions, and he was accurate as to the Holocaust. President Roosevelt's ambassador to Italy was also appointed in 1933. His name was Breckinridge Long, and he hailed from the Midwest. His ancestor was John Breckinridge, who had been vice president to one of our nation's most undistinguished presidents, the 15th president of the United States, James Buchanan. Breckinridge Long was a graduate of Princeton. I hope no one's related to James Buchanan. Breckinridge Long was a graduate of Princeton and a seasoned political operative who had run unsuccessfully for the Senate in Missouri twice. He first met Franklin Roosevelt when they both served in the Wilson administration. And as many of you know, Franklin Roosevelt, during the Wilson administration, was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. And he and John Long had adjacent offices, and they became good friends. Long, in fact, believed that they were such good friends that in 1933, after Roosevelt assumed the presidency, Long routinely referred to the United States Commander-in-Chief, the President of the United States, not as Mr. President, but simply as Frank. So let me read you a few of his letters that Breckinridge Long wrote to Frank, describing meeting Benito Mussolini for the first time. He's a man of comparatively short stature, with a very soft, well-modulated voice and an air of quiet and dignified elegance. In another letter, Long referred to Mussolini as, quote, a man of astounding character. Long's admiration for the Italian leader didn't end there. He wrote that the fascists and their black shirts are apparently in every community. They are dapper and well-dressed and standing straight and lend an atmosphere of individuality and importance to their surroundings. There's more. Long added a line that many of you might recognize. This is a quote. The trains are punctual, well-equipped, and fast. So in short, Long's assessment of Mussolini was he might be a fascist dictator, but he made the trains run on time. And I guess because everybody surrounding El Duce was apparently very well dressed, at least from Long's point of view, things were going along pretty swimmingly in Italy. Long's lack of judgment was even more acute and even more dangerous after Roosevelt appointed him in 1940 as an Assistant Secretary of State, with European immigration being central to his portfolio. It was in this position, within the State Department, that Long did real damage. In a memorandum to one of his colleagues about admitting Jewish refugees from Europe, Long wrote, we can delay and effectively stop for a temporary period of indefinite length the number of immigrants into the United States. We could do this by simply advising our consuls to put every obstacle in the way and to require additional evidence and to resort to various administrative devices which would postpone and postpone and postpone the granting of visas. And sadly, Long's strategy was very successful. And one of my favorite exchanges between Eleanor Roosevelt and her husband, the First Lady is reading the morning paper at the breakfast table with the President, and she's reading an article about Long's stonewalling of immigrants hoping for admission to the United States. And she turns to the President, who's buttering his toast, and she says, you know, he's a fascist. So Franklin Roosevelt, who went to prep school and to Harvard, and had this wonderful patrician voice, looks up at his wife and he says, oh, Eleanor, you must not say that. And she stares him dead-eye, and she says, maybe I shouldn't say it, but he is. And she was right. And by the way, I could only find one photograph of Breckinridge Long. I don't think it's in this group of photographs. I think he may have been camera shy for a good reason. William Bullitt is perhaps one of the most interesting diplomats you may never have heard of or know little about. He was the first United States ambassador to the Soviet Union, and as I mentioned, he later served as the US ambassador to France. A graduate of Yale College, at the age of only 28, he was tasked to negotiate with Vladimir Lenin at the Paris Peace Treaty talks in 1919. In 1926, after leaving government and being very critical of Woodrow Wilson, he wrote a novel that outsold The Great Gatsby, which was published in the same year. He also co-authored a biography of Woodrow Wilson with Sigmund Freud, and he helped Freud escape from Vienna. Bullitt counted Henri Matisse, the artist, as a friend, and Ernest Hemingway used to drop by his country estate outside Paris, and together they drank very good wine. Bullitt had an 18,000 bottle wine cellar. And they also shot clay pigeons, and hopefully they shot the clay pigeons before drinking the wine. So let me read a few excerpts from a number of letters that Bullitt wrote to President Roosevelt, some of them which are deeply personal. In 1934, after having served in Moscow for only a few months, Bullitt wrote, I'm a bit homesick. In many years, I have not had the sensation that I had a home. But in this past year, you and Mrs. Roosevelt have made me feel that I was a member of the family. And the thing I miss so much is the afternoons and evenings with you in the White House. I'm much too fond of you all. And in other letters, he actually conveyed his love for the president. Bullitt, as you might have gathered, was the consummate flatterer. He left Moscow in the summer of 1936, and months later he was appointed, as I noted earlier, as ambassador to France. In early 1937, he traveled to Berlin, where he met with Hermann Göring, who was head of the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force. Now, Ambassador Dodd, by the way, he was still ambassador at this point. He hadn't quite left. But he had vowed never to meet with any of the Nazi leadership. He was disgusted with them. He privately referred to Hitler, Göring, and Goebbels as murderers. This didn't stop Bullitt. But after meeting with Göring, Bullitt wrote to President Roosevelt and recounted how he and the Reichsmarshal had sat across from one another. And Bullitt described the chairs in which they sat. These chairs of mammoth proportions, covered with cerise velvet trimmed with gold. The chairs were so big that Göring looked rather less the size of a normal man, and as you know, he strongly resembles the hind end of an elephant. In my chair, I must have looked like some kind of animated flea. Bullitt went on to, in a more serious vein, to describe the substance of the meeting with the head of the Luftwaffe. Göring expressed to me his desire to have better relations with the US. However, neither he nor anyone else in the German government could recognize Dodd as an American ambassador. Dodd was too filled with a venomous hatred of Germany. So this is somewhat unusual to have one ambassador really stabbing another ambassador in the back. Bullitt was extremely ambitious. He desperately wanted to be the Secretary of State. And indeed, he often acted as though he were Secretary of State. He advised the president to replace Dodd as soon as possible. And in another letter to the president, he wrote, "For any man who spoke good German and had brains and bluntness, it would, I think, be the easiest thing in the world to have a direct relationship with Göring." So Bullitt, to put it mildly, had very sharp elbows. It's not unknown in Washington. In 1938, Bullitt counseled Roosevelt that the only way to avoid a European war was if there could be some sort of rapprochement between France and Germany. And not surprisingly, he offered himself as an intermediary. But after Hitler's troops invaded Poland in September 1939, and Great Britain and France declared war on Germany, Bullitt changed his tune. He immediately began to advise the president to rearm the United States. He was really the first to do so. He specifically called for a massive program to manufacture airplanes. Now, in fact, little fighting took place on the Western Front until May 1940, when Germany invaded the Low Countries, including, as I mentioned, Luxembourg, and then breached the French Maginot Line, which the Maginot Line was a defensive line that the French had established. And in June of 1940, Roosevelt as German forces amassed on the outskirts of Paris, Roosevelt instructed Bullitt to vacate the embassy. However, Bullitt wrote him back and said, he didn't really talk about leaving the embassy. He wrote back and he said, "The Paris police have no weapons except antiquated shot rifles." And he added that he had no intention of leaving his post. He said, "Even though we have exactly 2 revolvers in this entire mission with only 40 bullets. And Bullitt ended his letter by saying, "If I should get blown up before I see you again, I want you to know that it has been marvelous to work for you, and I thank you from the bottom of my heart for your friendship." Bullitt, to state the obvious, had a flair for the dramatic. The last ambassador featured in the book is Joseph P. Kennedy, who I assume many of you are somewhat familiar with. Kennedy and Roosevelt never really liked each other, and you get the feeling that they were always playing a kind of political chess match against one another. But the board was almost always stacked against Kennedy, in part because he was his own worst enemy. So let me share with you a few stories which I think will give you a flavor of the relationship between the two men. While vacationing on the French Riviera in the summer of 1939, and without approval from the Department of State, Ambassador Kennedy granted an exclusive interview to the Hearst newspapers. This was a big mistake. This was the newspaper chain owned by one of President Roosevelt's most vociferous critics, William Randolph Hearst. And the article quoted Kennedy advising Americans, quote, "not to lose their heads." Kennedy made clear his belief that the United States should stay on the sidelines if war came to Europe. And really by this point, Roosevelt, I think, was pretty convinced that the United States at some point would have to become involved in Europe. And he didn't appreciate having one of his ambassadors limiting his options. He certainly didn't like the implication that the US should reach out to Hitler and try to achieve some sort of economic accommodation. And that's exactly what Kennedy was advocating. That same summer, Secretary of Treasury Henry Morgenthau, one of Roosevelt's neighbor in the New York Hudson Valley, visited Kennedy at the ambassador's vacation home in Cannes, France. And when he returned to Washington, Morgenthau met with Roosevelt in the Oval Office, and he fed the president's irritation with Kennedy by suggesting that Kennedy had a very close relationship with Neville Chamberlain, and that it was based on their mutual view that appeasement of Hitler was the right strategy. And Roosevelt really, this upset Roosevelt when he heard this from Morgenthau. And sitting directly across from Morgenthau, the president made a startling accusation. He said, "I don't think there's any question but that Joe is disloyal to his country." However, in 1939, Roosevelt still wasn't ready to get rid of Kennedy. Indeed, he wanted to keep him in England, as far away as possible from the 1940 US presidential election. FDR worried that if Kennedy returned to America, he might make political mischief and might even run for the presidency himself. And after referring to Kennedy as a traitor in 1939, the following year, the president wrote Kennedy a letter that expressed a very different sentiment, telling him, "Joe, I get constant reports of how valuable you are to the British and that it helps their morale to have you there." So, like Bullitt, President Roosevelt knew how to flatter men. Nevertheless, only a few days later, after Roosevelt's reassurances, Kennedy picked up the morning paper in London, and he learned that the president had been secretly negotiating Lend-Lease with Prime Minister Churchill. Now, Lend-Lease is the provision to provide mothballed American ships and weapons to the British to defend themselves. When Kennedy read this story in the paper, he was outraged, and he immediately wrote to President Roosevelt. This is what he said: "I've been fairly active in any enterprise which I've taken up for the last 25 years, frankly, and I do not enjoy being a dummy. I'm very unhappy about the whole position." And then he added in something of a threatening way, he said there's always the alternative of resigning. And in the end, that's exactly what happened. Kennedy resigned, but he did it late in the political season, just really before the election. And so by this point, Roosevelt was happy to see him leave, happy to have Kennedy out of government. And Kennedy largely stayed on the sidelines during the rest of the election season, and so Roosevelt's strategy was actually successful. So Watching Darkness Fall follows the story of these four ambassadors and the president they served. And I tried to provide the backdrop of what was happening politically, not only in Europe with the rise of fascism, but in the United States as well. Roosevelt was constantly balancing his foreign policy concerns against his domestic considerations. And as I noted at the beginning of this talk, his ambassadors were a problematic group of men. I write that Breckinridge-Long may have been the worst appointment that Roosevelt made during his entire presidency. The Kennedy appointment was ill-fated from the beginning because Roosevelt never really liked or trusted him. William Dodd was not cut out to be an ambassador, but he was clearly prescient, and he influenced FDR by sounding the alarm very early about Hitler. So he did play a very positive role. And William Bullitt, despite his constant self-aggrandizing and transparent attempts to ingratiate himself with the president, he did play a very important role in convincing Roosevelt to rearm the United States at a critical time. So which of these ambassadors did Roosevelt turn to as the war intensified in Europe and it became clear that the United States would have to play a more forceful role? And the answer is none of them. He turned instead to Harry Hopkins, his former Secretary of Commerce and one of Eleanor Roosevelt's favorite people. Hopkins was from Iowa. He was neither Ivy League educated nor steeped in foreign policy. He was by training a social worker. He was also brilliant, charming, and enormously politically astute. I recount a wonderful scene in in the book, in early 1941, Roosevelt asked Hopkins to spend time in London with Winston Churchill, whom at the time, incidentally, Roosevelt did not especially like or trust. He didn't really know him. I digress for just a second. Roosevelt claimed Roosevelt had met Churchill when he was the Assistant Secretary of Navy, and Churchill was the Lord of the Admiralty. And Roosevelt recalled that Churchill, he thought, he had this sort of British superiority, and he was something of a snob and arrogant. And Churchill didn't remember meeting Roosevelt, which, at any rate. So Roosevelt wanted Hopkins to assess the resolve of the British people. He wanted him to really assess Churchill's capacity to lead as well. And he was supposed to stay in London for just 2 weeks, but he wound up staying for 6 weeks, during which time he met with Britain's top military strategists, generals, and business leaders. And Hopkins and Churchill became very close to one another. And the night before Hopkins was returned to the United States, Churchill gave him a dinner party. And near the end of the evening, Hopkins rose from the table to offer a toast to Churchill. And he began by saying with a little bit of a wry smile, he said, "I suppose you're all wondering what I'm going to say to President Roosevelt upon my return. Well, I'm going to quote you a verse from the Book of Books. Where thou goest, I will go. And whither thou lodgest, I will lodge. And thy people shall be my people, and thy God, my God." And Hopkins raised his glass, and others at the table noticed tears streaming down the face of Winston Churchill. Hopkins' fondness for Churchill was critical to the relationship between Britain and the United States. And in my book, I write that Churchill and Roosevelt, who had been equally skeptical of each other, both trusted Harry Hopkins. And of course, it was the beginning of a remarkable alliance. So I'll leave it there except to say a few final words about Franklin Roosevelt. And not everyone will agree with this. I consider him one of America's greatest presidents. He led the country through the Great Depression and met the challenge of World War II. He was an extraordinary person, but he was not a man without flaws. His speechwriter, Robert Sherwood, famously wrote of President Roosevelt's, quote, "heavily forested interior. His character was not only multiplex, it was contradictory to a bewildering degree." And I think that brilliantly describes Franklin Roosevelt. He was an enormously empathetic individual, but he was also very unsentimental when he needed to be. He was an idealist, but he was also very much a clear-eyed pragmatist. He was enormously political, but he was also very courageous. So finally, I'll just say that I appreciated the complimentary blurbs that I received from fellow authors on the back of my book, Watching Darkness Fall. My favorite blurb is from a Pulitzer Prize winner, Kai Bird, who wrote the biography Oppenheimer, which also became an Oscar-winning movie a few years ago. And Kai praised the book as, quote, "high drama, diplomatic intrigue, and damn good chinwag." Now, if you don't know what chinwag means, and I didn't, you'll have to look it up yourself, and then you'll have to buy the book and decide if he's right. So again, thank you all for being here tonight. I've really enjoyed myself, and it's been a great honor. Thank you.
Now it's time for everyone for questions here.
Question for the ambassador. Do you believe Kennedy's preference for appeasement was related to a desire to keep his sons out of a future war?
I think it had something to do with that, yes, I do. I write a fair amount about his sons in the book, actually, because they visited with William Bullitt in France, and then the oldest of the two, Joe Jr., actually traveled to Germany, and this is in the early 30s. And he was very, very impressed by the Nazis, which is interesting. But as you know, after war broke out, Joe actually enlisted and died he was flying with the British Air Command and died overseas. So he did give his life to his country. And of course, John Kennedy also served admirably. But Joe was Joe wanted one of his sons to be president. I mean, he thought about that when they were in college. So he had big plans for him, and dying in war was not one of those plans.
David, can you talk about Dodd's post-war involvement?
Well, Dodd died in 1938, so he was, it's a very sad story with Dodd, or maybe it was 1939. But he leaves after he leaves the ambassadorship in Berlin. He comes back to the United States and he becomes very, very sick. And he had been speaking out against Hitler after he came back, telling everybody who was willing to listen about the dangers of the Nazi regime. But then he got a very debilitating disease that killed him in about 6 months. So it was a sad ending for Dodd.
Did he have relations with the judge that was at the Nuremberg trials?
No, he did not.
By the way, if you read Eric Larson's In the Garden of the Beast, it goes into details about William Dodd's ambassadorship.
I think there's a lot of concern that what we're seeing in this country resembles what was going on in Germany in the late 30s. Do you have any thoughts?
Which one of us?
Anybody who's familiar with history?
Dr. Simon, would you like to?
No.
I think that's called passing the buck.
Yeah. No?
You want me to take it?
Go ahead.
Well,
Give it a try, Chris.
I mean, this is what I was trying to emphasize in my little discussion, which was there was so much change happening so quickly, and a very unstable society in Germany in the 1930s, or rather in the 1920s, and then after the Great Depression hit, this simply exacerbated the political weakness of the Weimar system. The Weimar Republic actually had one of the most liberal constitutions that had ever, it was designed to be a very liberal proportional representation system, but it never really had a chance to experience stability with all of these forces, including internal forces, dedicated to its destruction. So you had communists, according to the then standard doctrine of Marxist-Leninism, Germany was going to be the center of the global world revolution, not Russia. And so in the 20s and in the 30s, this was a very real force among internal German politics. And then you had the right wing in Germany, which was part of it were monarchists that rejected the republic from the beginning, and some became increasingly radical racial nationalists, and they would gravitate to the Nazi Party. So there are parallels, I think the strongest parallels between the present day and the Weimar Republic. I don't think there's many because it was such a crisis period, but I do think, for example, one of the major defects of the Weimar political system was the reluctance of the political parties to compromise. And this led to intense polarization, which will then ultimately be exploited by the people getting sick of the parties in the middle and gravitating to the parties at the extreme. But the political system, it was a proportional representation, multi-party system, which we don't have. So I think it's always instructive to be conscious of the structural differences that separate us from these episodes in the past. But I don't think I'm treading on remarkably new ground to point out that the level of political discourse and the increasing polarization and indeed violence of the political rhetoric that's becoming common, exacerbated by the, shall we say, inflammatory components of social media, this does contribute to an environment where people are more used to shouting at each other than at listening to each other, and that is a characteristic of the Weimar Republic as well.
Did you want to add anything, sir?
I have two questions.
Hold on. Did you want to add anything, David?
Well, the only thing I'd add is I've just written another book, which will be out in May. And it's about our 50-year celebrations in this country and as sort of snapshots of our democracy. And so looking at the Jubilee in 1826 and the Centennial in 1876 and Bicentennial, and now, of course, we're approaching the 250th. And, I think sort of Ken Burns put it well, so I'll quote him. I'm very optimistic about the future of the country, but I'm very worried about the immediate in the country. And I guess I'll just leave it at that.
Hitler and the Nazis were obviously aware of the chaos that was rampant in Germany at that time. The first question is, did they cause it or did they just take advantage of it?
Both. I mean, street violence between opposing. The Communist Party had the Red Guard, which were uniformed goons that were around bashing each other. The SPD had paramilitary units. Some of the difficult parties also had uniformed youth groups. We hear about only the Hitler Youth, but so the political culture in Germany, yes, there was this militancy that was characteristic of the parties, and a lot of this is the fact that there never was a period after the incredible violence of World War I where things stabilized. And from American history at this time, we have the lost generation, the trauma experienced by the soldiers, etc. And in Germany, of course, yes, both the Sturmabteilung and the SA were brawlers. Part of the thing was to break up political meetings of your opponents and to defend yours against the other side. So street violence was quite common. And as I could only allude to the number of revolts that would occur on a regular basis where a city would go into a crisis mode and then paramilitary forces or the army would be required to come in and put it down. And this didn't happen just once, this happened again and again all over Germany. So the atmosphere, yes, was quite violent, and the Nazis were very happy to exploit that. This was one of the reasons why Hitler tried to establish himself as a national savior. The propaganda that he began to promote was that he would end the Brothers' War, that he would bring stability and peace once his rule was established. And of course, we know how this all played out, but that was part of the popularity of Hitler. He exploited people's desire for stability, and then, of course, led them down the path to complete destruction.
Support for this program is made possible by viewers like you. Thank you. Additional support is made possible by the Catherine B. Anderson Fund of the St. Paul and Minnesota Foundation. Upcoming roundtable topics can be found at www.mn-ww2roundtable.org. production services provided by